You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynne Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Good Friday, the 29th of March. Justice in Rochdale. Tower Hamlets voter fraud. Waves of refugees arrive in Italy and Malta. Cyprus bailout will see money flee Europe. Nick Griffin MEP from the belly of the beast. Cadbury's Sharia compliant Easter candies. Egypt going broke. Thought for the day, are we really animal lovers? And finally, don't have a curry near a dog track. UK news. Justice in Rochdale. Rochdale MP Simon Danchuk is on record saying police were failing sex abuse victims. At the time, the police angrily dismissed his allegation. Detective Constable Margaret Oliver joins Danchuk, adding her agreement to Danchuk's allegation. DC Oliver says men alleged to be part of a child grooming ring in Rochdale were never brought to justice because the evidence of 2 teenage victims was not pursued. As the witness manager assigned to 2 victims, she says she felt ashamed of her part in the process that won the girls' trust, only to betray it when she learnt the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, had decided not to call the girls as witnesses. One victim, who was just 14 years old when her sexual grooming began, says she has never been told why she was dropped as a prosecution witness. Some of the men who had abused her were never arrested or charged, and she says she still sees some of them walking around Rochdale. Tower Hamlets voter fraud. Andrew Gilligan in his Telegraph blog writes, today the Electoral Commission publishes its report into the dozens of allegations of postal vote fraud and irregularity, some made by me, at the April the 19th 2012 by-election in the Tower Hamlets Spitalfields ward, only a fortnight before the mayoral election in May. And the pattern of previous inadequate investigation appears to be repeating itself. The by-election was narrowly won by Lutfur's candidate and former election agent and paid town hall's advisor, Ghulam Rabbani, a man with close connections to Lutfur's extremist backers at the East London Mosque. And no stranger to questionable paperwork. Freedom of information requests show that Rabbani appears to have massively overcharged the taxpayer for his town hall services. He compares the Metropolitan Police investigations into the voter fraud to their farcical News of the World phone hacking scandal, saying, they simply refused to investigate seriously, doing just enough to enable them to claim that they had looked into it, but failing to follow obvious leads and neglecting to interview key witnesses. It looks like something similar is now happening in respect of persistent allegations of postal vote fraud in Tower Hamlets, run by the extremist-linked mayor Lutfur Rahman. European news. Waves of refugees arrive in Italy and Malta. Officials in Italy and Malta said that waves of refugees recently arrived on their shores in 4 boats carrying a total of 342 migrants. The Italian Coast Guard intercepted 3 boats with 260 people who were taken to the Lampedusa immigration facility. The Maltese armed forces rescued 82 migrants from Somalia who were forced to send out a distress signal when their dinghy's engine failed. Cyprus bailout will see money flee Europe. Luxembourg Finance Minister Luc Friedin has told Der Spiegel that the Cypriot bailout, which involves seizing investors' money in failed banks, could destroy the trust of savers in other Euro countries. This will lead to a situation in which investors invest their money outside the Eurozone, he noted. I now hand you over to Nick Griffin MEP. He talks today on the weather, global warming fantasies and little sheep.
I've got no news from Parliament this week for the simple reason that I couldn't get there. We've spent most of this week firmly shut up here in the hills by the biggest snowdrifts anyone has seen around here since 1962. While the main roads were cleared quite quickly, the back lanes up here at 1,000 feet were blocked by 2 solid days of high wind and drifting, and it's taken nearly a week for a combination of hours of shovelling and the belated arrival of a JCB to let us out. I have heard that several of the Green MEPs were busy telling anyone who would listen that the unseasonably cold weather all over Europe is the result of man-made climate change. According to this desperate new theory, low levels of Arctic sea ice, caused by man-made global warming, have caused shifts in high-level wind patterns, leading to winter conditions not seen for 50 years. There are, of course, several huge flaws with this argument. First, the much vaunted computer models on which the self-proclaimed science of long-term climate prediction are based totally fail to predict any of this. 10 years ago, you may remember, pro-warmist papers such as The Independent ran reports claiming that winter snow in Britain was now more or less a thing of the past. Children would grow up not knowing what a snowball was, and so on. Second, even the Met Office's own graphs now confirm that there hasn't been any global warming for 16 years. How something that hasn't happened could cause anything else to happen is unexplained, because it's inexplicable. Nonsense always is. Third, if the snowdrifts that stopped me getting to Brussels were, as the warmest cranks insist, caused by global warming that hasn't happened, then what caused the ones back in 1962? The gullibility of intellectuals and grant-hungry pseudoscientists would be laughable, were it not for the fact that their self-serving globalist fantasy is costing the people of Britain £18 billion a year, nearly 9 times the cost of being ruled by Brussels, and that figure is rising every year as the political elite pile on taxes and close down perfectly serviceable power stations. We can only hope that, when the lights start going out, the rioting mobs that come out to play will start by lynching a few of the Labour, Lib Dem and Tory MPs who passed the Climate Change Act, the most expensive suicide note in economic history. In the meantime, and back to cold, harsh reality, spare a thought for the hill farmers of Britain, who are spending this Easter weekend desperately fighting to save their flocks of sheep and newborn lambs from the snowdrifts and the cold. These men and women, the ones who do so much to preserve the wonderful landscapes of our uplands, are not to be confused with the thoroughly spoiled, subsidy-gobbling grain and oilseed rape barons of the south and east of England. The agribusiness multimillionaires, investment portfolios, and descendants of various royal bastards who still own vast swathes of lowland England rake in the lion's share of Britain's take from the EU's dysfunctional common agricultural policy pot. The average Welsh hill farmer, by contrast, earns around £8,000 a year. The same is true all over northern England and in Scotland too. They farm because it's all they can do, because their wives also work to bring in the cash they need to live, because they hope for better days for their sons who will follow them, and because they love what they do. Many of them are remarkably soft about their animals. When we kept our own pigs, several of our neighbouring farmers told us they couldn't kill and eat an animal they'd reared themselves. And the one who called at our neighbour's the other evening, with his big arms full of orphaned or triplet lambs, all dying in the cold, was truly upset to have lost 40 already to the bitter wind and a marauding fox, and to have more than he and the farm lad could possibly keep alive. So as Rhiannon was there while back from college, we've now also got a pair of cade lambs living in a dog's bed full of straw in our downstairs toilet. They are, of course, impossibly cute and absurdly noisy when they decide it's time for their latest bottles of sheep's milk substitute. The cat, who is of course well aware of her status as cutest member of the household, is disgusted. The Rottie isn't sure if we've gone mad or if we're fattening him up a special Easter Sunday treat. Whether they will fatten up is of course questionable. We've bottle-reared cade lambs on and off for more than 20 years and are all too well acquainted with their tendency to expire with monotonous regularity. Still, the majority usually make it, which is a much better chance than the certain miserable deaths they faced out with the ice and the fox. The pantomime fairy tale image of the fox, plausible, sly and self-centred, brings me on to Nigel Farage and the BBC's safety valve of choice. I'm sure you're already aware of how UKIP is being ruthlessly promoted by the anti-British BBC as a way of simultaneously blocking the BNP and splitting the Tory vote. You probably also noticed the meeting between Farage and Rupert Murdoch, which should have killed stone dead anyone's illusion that UKIP could possibly be some cleverly disguised but essentially genuinely nationalist force. The truth, of course, is that UKIP is more Tory than the Tories. Not just in its addiction to so-called free trade that's destroyed Britain's manufacturing base, nor its near deification of the unspeakably corrupt banking sector. Ultra-Tory also is UKIP's desire to abolish whole rafts of basic protection for millions of British workers, sick pay and holiday pay in particular are in UKIP's sight for obliteration. Even Maggie Thatcher's bogus "we're being swamped" con on immigration, implying a determination to stem the tide that never ever existed, is mirrored by the sly and cynical Farage. UKIP are presented by the mass media as tough on immigration and put out brutally racist attacks on white, Christian East Europeans in elections. But look into the detail of their so-called balanced migration policy, and what emerges is a blueprint for the continued replacement of the native British in our own country. To the civic pseudo-nationalists of UKIP, you see, it's all just a question of numbers. Mr Farage has no problem with Islam, so for every Brit who leaves, they're happy to let in another Somali or Pakistani, plus an extra 50,000 a year. So with, for example, a typical annual total of 250,000 Brits emigrating, UKIP's policy would let in 250,000 Africans and Asians. Their big complaint about Polish immigrants is that they're taking up places that UKIP would rather see filled by people from our traditional source of migrants, God help us. So that's a population change of 500,000 a year, on top of which UKIP then say they'd let in a further 50,000 third worlders every year. Coincidentally, 50,000 immigrants a year was the figure in the late 1960s, when Enoch Powell famously warned that the policy was mad, literally mad, like watching a nation heaping up its own funeral pyre. Indeed it is, which is what makes UKIP's role as a futile, wickedly deceptive safety valve so dangerous, and so important that we stick to our guns, despite the frustration of seeing Farage twisting the words we've spoken to make his and Murdoch's trap for fools. We aren't alone in seeing through the UKIP patriotism hoax. An informative expose has just appeared on the website of the nationalist think tank Third Way, which we will be reproducing on our own website. This focuses primarily on UKIP's Friends of Israel pressure group, reporting that UKIP's National Secretary, Michael Zuckerman, told the Jewish Chronicle, quote, "There's tremendous support for Israel within UKIP," unquote. The JC also reports that the party leader is on board, quote, "Mr Farage strongly supports moves by the party's most senior Jewish figure, its Secretary Michael Zuckerman, to establish an active Friends of Israel group," unquote. The mission statement of the group makes it clear that the UKIP Zionists want concrete links with the Israeli government. Quote, "Friends of Israel in UKIP will also seek to foster links with the Israeli government and people in order to provide an avenue for the discourse and meeting of minds which cements true friendship," unquote. As you would expect from such second fiddles in the Zionist orchestra, UKIP are banging the drum for action against the supposed threat from Iran's nuclear power program, and say they would support efforts to eliminate it, quote, "by targeted military means," unquote, if necessary. What form this support would take is not made clear. Now, the BNP is quite a broad church with regard to Israel. We have members who, personally, agree with the Torah true Orthodox Jews who want to see the Israeli state replaced by a Palestinian one. Others who support a two-state solution. Others who support the continued existence of Israel as a homeland for the Jews. But as genuine nationalists, we all recognise that our personal opinions of what should happen in a place several thousand miles from our shores has nothing whatsoever to do with Britain, and certainly nothing to do with the British government, any British government. The whole of the Middle East is not worth the bones of a single British soldier. The quarrels there are not our business. We've got plenty of things to sort out here at home without meddling in the affairs of other peoples. So, as the Third Way article says, true nationalists don't want anything to do with an attack on Iran or any other country which doesn't attack us. We have no desire to fight proxy wars for Israel or anyone else. Genuine nationalists view with great suspicion the motives of those who promote war and conflict with Iran and other nations. The way in which the Zionist lobby seeks to influence the foreign and defence policies of our nation should be a matter of grave concern. No nationalist should be under any illusion. UKIP will sell out our country, involve us in foreign wars, and support a Zionist agenda which places the interests of Israel above the interests of Britain. UKIP are no different from all the other sellout politicians we have to suffer in this regard. A UKIP vote is a vote for more of the same, not for change. Well said, that man. We'll be going head to head with UKIP in the coming South Shields by-election. We'll be pointing out their real nature and offering a real alternative to the corruption of the old elite. And we will keep on doing so, for UKIP won't be with us forever, since the sly fox Farage really wants nothing more than to destroy Cameron and become a Tory MP himself. In all probability, he will get his wish, and UKIP will merge back into the ultra-right of the Tory party from which it emerged. We simply have to stay in the field until then, because then the way ahead for us will be clear. Our time will come.
Thank you very much, Nick, and have a happy Easter from Radio Britain and World at 8. World News. Cadbury's Sharia-compliant Easter candies. As Cadbury's ramps up its inventory for Easter, a little-known fact has come to light about its candies. Many are Sharia-compliant. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, Halal certification has become big business as Sharia law continues to extend throughout Australian culture. Cadbury's Halal certification includes 71 products which are halal, ranging from Cadbury mini eggs to caramello koalas to red tulip chocolates. Strangely enough, the website also states, "We do not have any kosher certified products." Cadbury also pay for halal certification on the Easter product range, even though Easter is a Christian celebration and nothing to do with Islam, says Kiralee Smith, who runs a website called Halal Choices, the Herald reports. World at 8 says, boycott Cadbury's. Easter is a pagan festival for the Muslims anyway, so it makes no sense to accede to their cultural demands. Egypt going broke. Daniel Greenfield of frontpagemag.com writes, Islam is apparently how you spell bad investment. Moody's cut Egypt's credit rating on Thursday, citing unsettled political conditions and public finances, which it said raised the chance of a default within 5 years to nearly 40%. The Egyptian economy has been in crisis since the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak in 2011, with Islamist President Mohamed Morsi's cash-strapped government grappling with sliding currency reserves, dwindling tourism, a soaring budget deficit and a wave of often violent street protests. Moody's cut the country's credit rating by one notch from B3 to CAA1, which it said meant it now sees nearly a 10% chance of Egypt defaulting on its debt over the next year, and slightly less than a 40% chance for default within 5 years. Thought for the day. Are we really animal lovers? Well, we Brits have always been thought of as animal lovers, which have drawn the mirth and scorn of the rest of Europe and the world upon us at one time or another. I still like to think of us as animal lovers, and I still believe I would rather be an animal, whether domestic or farm variety, in this country than say Poland or the Far East, even with today's rising track record of UK animal cruelty, halal killings and importing of endangered species skins for so-called fashion. The sight of Nancy Dell'Olio, or Olive Oil as I call her, sporting leather trousers, fur coat and pony hair bag says it all for today's minor celebs and their priorities. However, elsewhere in the world, animal cruelty is alive and not so kicking, as indeed a myriad of online petitions can testify, and which I sign religiously. To name just a few, we have bear baiting in Pakistan, just to add to the ghastly sight of the starving dogs and the working animals. India with its sacred cows, which is just the lazy Indian way of not feeding or looking after them, but slaughtering them for leather. China and the habit of eating everything short of each other, which actually might be a good way of reducing their population, and the nasty habit they and others in the Far East have of tying dogs and cats up and beating them to death for the flavour of the meat. Not to mention their habit, along with the Japanese, of eating meat when it is still alive, which is thoroughly horrible to Western eyes. Bullfighting is a despicable and outdated sport, as is bull running and the baiting of small calves by young boys for practice. In South America, the so-called bullfights consist out there of shell-suited thugs chasing a bull. 2 of these thugs got killed this week. Good for the bull, I say. Tying eagles to bulls' backs seems fun, as does the Spanish habit of throwing a goat off a tall tower. You know, saving the human race doesn't seem quite so important to me now after reading this lot. Now that tourism in Egypt has fallen off, no doubt the fellahin, that is Egyptian for peasants, will take it out on their poor carriage horses in places like Luxor, which are half-starved and beaten, and in the case of our horse-drawn carriage some years ago, could barely walk. In fact, the poor animal was so thin we all got out and gave the owner money to feed it. He grinned in all his gappy-toothed glory and seemed totally ignorant of any part of animal welfare, and I hope actually fed the animal he was making money out of. As to the unnecessarily cruel slaughter and deaths of millions of animals for their fur, skin and feathers, words fail me. This is a cruelty which I thought had died out with the Victorian era, and certainly throughout the 70s through to the 90s it was discouraged under the PC Brigade to wear anything consisting of those materials. Now, however, we're all against blood diamonds, but the trade in ivory for money, rhino horn and tiger bits for little eastern willies, reptile skins for slags, and sheep, cat and dog trimmings for even worse slags appear to be the norm again, and in fact the numbers have increased dramatically thanks to greed and the internet. One has to say that although we do not have bear baiting any longer, there is a section of so-called society amongst us that still revel in cockfighting, dog-fighting and badger baiting, all unnecessary and cruel, but great money spinners amongst those people that appear not to have any money or brains to get it any other way. Of course nowadays with the immigration we have the Eastern European gypsies and Asians bringing their own form of animal cruelty with them. Although reading the latest case of what is widely publicised as dangerous dog gang kills girl, I wonder if we really need anyone else on the scene when it comes to sheer stupidity. But it's on my home run that my thought today concentrates. How in the name of all that is good and English do we give birth on this island to a certain section of people who are almost as bad as their foreign counterparts? In a previous World at 8 I briefly touched on the subject of licences for dogs and the way some people kept their animals. I also said that deaths would increase if the owners kept on abusing their animals, either through ignorance or greed or stupidity or a combination of all three. The death of J. Lomas Anderson highlights my case exactly. There were a large number of large dogs kept by the owner, Bev Concannon, in her appalling back garden. No grass, no space, no nothing. Certainly not enough for 2 staffies and 2 bull mastiffs and 1 small Shih Tzu not involved in the attack. These dogs, although thought of as family pets, were not kept in a family environment. They were probably caged most of the time, never walked or exercised, and had never been to training school. Their mother probably had them to make money out of in a typically ignorant slapdash way common amongst her sort. They were probably not fed regularly, and when they were loose and saw a youngster with a meat pie, that was it. Appalling though it was, I can understand the dogs. They smelt meat, and dogs are pack animals when not trained or loved or kept in good condition. Get over it. Do not keep large dogs if you live in a rabbit hutch of a home, with strangers coming and going all hours of day and night. Although legal, the dogs above are primarily hunting, guard and working dogs. When they're trained and loved and looked after, they are lovely animals, but they are still animals and react to certain situations in a dog-like fashion. Without sounding snobby, and I really don't care if I do, you only have to look at the Concannon hovel and the awful teddy bears in memoriam to understand why I feel sorry for those animals and Jade, but not the rest of that rabble. Concannon is a single mother of 5 children living off benefits and selling off her dog's progeny on Facebook for extra money. A good background in it. She should be prosecuted for cruelty to animals and forbidden ever owning even a tame fly again. We have of course the gang culture with the poor animals concerned, raised or just about with no love, beatings and regular baitings, using the local cats and smaller dogs of the estate. This must be hell for dogs. Of course they are dangerous. They have been encouraged to be just that by their less than human owners. What real man needs a huge sodding dog to walk around with to appear cool? Not much of one in my book, matey. So this England of ours is apparently swimming in massive dangerous dog gangs, and I think as such that we should be allowed to possess guns. Not because I would shoot the dogs, I wouldn't, but I would have a pop at the owners. I would love a dog, but space, money and 3 cats doesn't permit it. As I said to all the good dog owners out there, you don't need a licence, the animals should have the inspection and the licences for the bad owners, but of course a bad owner usually doesn't see themselves as such. Unlike Islam, which despises dogs and will probably have them all halal killed to go into the food chain, I love dogs. All shapes, sizes and makes. They are fascinating creatures, almost as lovely as cats, but not quite. Dogs, well looked after and treated, make wonderful family pets, as long as little Darren isn't allowed to stick his fingers in his eyes, that is. I say we should give more power to the police, if they were interested that is, to actually inspect certain reported instances of dog abuse, frantic barking or fighting, because that, like a baby crying, is a warning sign that not all is right with the animal or animals. And in these days of greed it seems that nothing is out of the norm for dogs, bless them. Anything goes. For a start, people buying puppies off Facebook should be stopped. That would stop part of this trade immediately. Amateurs are now breeding dogs for sale, sometimes in the most awful conditions, and selling them on. I'm a believer that if you keep an animal as a pet, keep it well and give it a good life. If you keep and breed animals, the same applies. If you're a farmer and kill your animals for food and money, keep them well and slaughter them well. And if you have a very bad weather warning in good time, get your lambing ewes into the large shed before the sodding snow, not whine about it afterwards. Those poor frozen sheep really got my goat, if you'll excuse the pun. Happy bunny, rabbits and Easter. And finally, don't have a curry near a dog racing track. A BBC programme which started out to allay the disgust of young diners over the horse meat scandal and relaying the useful message that we might all be eating horse meat one day has raised even more fears over the foreign fast food industry in our capital city and throughout the UK. It's been reported by the Telegraph yesterday that during the show entitled Horse Meat Banquet on BBC Three, during which random dishes were DNA tested for contents, one particular dish was a mystery, even to the show's nutritionist Surinder Full, that's Coles to Newcastle if anything was, who stated, "It's absolutely terrifying because if it isn't any of the meats we know, well, what is it?" Food experts who analysed the dish, a lamb curry bought in London, ruled out a series of meats including lamb, beef, chicken, pork, goat, horse and even human flesh. The alarming DNA findings prompted fears that it could in fact contain dog or even cat meat. The usual questions over this mystery meat were, where's it come from? Where was it slaughtered? Was it hygienic? Are there any bacteria it was covered with? Not whose poor unfortunate pet it was. It engaged food experts to test a range of products from a lamb curry bought at an identified shop in the capital to Chinese takeaways to fast food burgers. It found Chinese beef in black bean sauce meal contained mostly chicken blood and other material from the animal and only a tiny proportion of beef. A burger was found to contain no beef meat, instead just bovine blood and high levels of chicken blood. The only high street fast food to test positively was a doner kebab, which was found to be made entirely from lamb, the Independent reported. Clearly not from a Blackpool kebab shop. This presenter says, "What surprises me is the shock the media lovies are showing. It's been well known for years, ever since takeaways came into this country, that the meat is often suspect. Rather like that old joke, don't go to a Chinese takeaway when all the dogs and cats have vanished from the area. We are, after all, paying lots of money to peoples who think nothing of eating anything that crawls, swims, slithers, flies, or is a domesticated pet." You've been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynne Mozart and I and the team at World at 8 and Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and safe Easter holiday. The Reverend West will be giving an Easter sermon this Easter Sunday. Let's hope we nationalists do not forget the true meaning of Easter and rebirth this year. We will not be on air Monday, we are taking the bank holiday off and we will be with you again Wednesday. Good night.
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynne Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Good Friday, the 29th of March. Justice in Rochdale. Tower Hamlets voter fraud. Waves of refugees arrive in Italy and Malta. Cyprus bailout will see money flee Europe. Nick Griffin MEP from the belly of the beast. Cadbury's Sharia-compliant Easter candies. Egypt going broke, thought for the day, are we really animal lovers? And finally, don't have a curry near a dog track. UK news. Just witnesses. It looks like something similar is now happening in respect of persistent allegations of postal vote fraud in Tower Hamlets, run by the extremist linked mayor Lutfur Rahman. European news. Waves of refugees arrive in Italy and Malta. Officials in Italy and Malta said that waves of refugees recently arrived on their shores in 4 boats carrying a total of 342 migrants. The Italian Coast Guard intercepted 3 boats with 260 people who were taken to the Lampedusa immigration facility. The Maltese armed forces rescued 82 migrants from Somalia who were forced to send out a distress signal when their dinghy's engine failed. Cyprus bailout will see money flee Europe. Luxembourg Finance Minister Luc Friedin has told Der Spiegel that the Cypriot bailout, which involves seizing investors' money in failed banks, could destroy the trust of savers in other Euro countries. This will lead to a situation in which investors invest their justice in Rochdale. Rochdale MP Simon Danchuk is on record saying police were failing sex abuse victims. At the time, the police angrily dismissed his allegation. Detective Constable Margaret Oliver joins Danchuk, adding her agreement to Danchuk's allegation. DC Oliver says men alleged to be part of a child grooming ring in Rochdale were never brought to justice because the evidence of 2 teenage victims was not pursued. As the witness manager assigned to 2 victims, she says she felt ashamed of her part in the process that won the girls' trust, only to betray it when she learnt the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, had decided not to call the girls as witnesses. One victim, who was just 14 years old when her sexual grooming began, says she has never been told why she was dropped as a prosecution witness. Some of the men who had abused her were never arrested or charged, and she says she still sees some of them walking around Rochdale. Tower Hamlets voter fraud. Andrew Gilligan in his Telegraph blog writes, "Today the Electoral Commission publishes its report into the dozens of allegations of postal vote fraud and irregularity, some made by me, at the April 19, 2012 by-election in the Tower Hamlets Spitalfields ward, only a fortnight before the mayoral election in May. And the pattern of previous inadequate investigation appears to be repeating itself. The by-election was narrowly won by Lutfur's candidate and former election agent and paid town hall's advisor, Ghulam Rabbani, a man with close connections to Lutfur's extremist backers at the East London Mosque, and no stranger to questionable paperwork. Freedom of Information requests show that Rabbani appears to have massively overcharged the taxpayer for his town hall services. He compares the Metropolitan Police investigations into the voter fraud to their farcical News of the World phone hacking scandal, saying, "They simply refused to investigate seriously, doing just enough to enable them to claim that they had looked into it, but failing to follow obvious leads and neglecting to interview key money outside the Eurozone," he noted. I now hand you over to Nick Griffin, MEP. He talks today on the weather, global warming fantasies and little sheep.
I've got no news from Parliament this week for the simple reason that I couldn't get there. We've spent most of this week firmly shut up here in the hills by the biggest snowdrifts anyone has seen around here since 1962. While the main roads were cleared quite quickly, the back lanes up here at 1,000 feet were blocked by 2 solid days of high wind and drifting, and it's taken nearly a week for a combination of hours of shovelling and the belated arrival of a JCB to let us out. I have heard that several of the Green MEPs were busy telling anyone who would listen that the unseasonably cold weather all over Europe is the result of man-made climate change. According to this desperate new theory, low levels of Arctic sea ice, caused by man-made global warming, have caused shifts in high-level wind patterns